I know our two keynote speakers today will talk about this a lot more and a lot more eloquently than I will do. Our first speaker today is Dr. Silvia Masiero. Sorry, the doctor fell off your name there, Silvia. She's an associate professor of information systems at the University of Oslo. She has authored over 30 peer-reviewed works in the domain of information and communication technology for development, and she has a long-standing interest in the role of digital platforms in socio-economic development processes. I will immediately also tell you that this afternoon from 2, we have Dr. Samuel Romani, who is an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. He's a geopolitical commentator who regularly contributes to media publications and think tanks, including the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Middle East Institute. He regularly appears on broadcast media outlets, and he has written 2 books, Russia in Africa, Resurgent, Great Power or Bellicose Pretender, and Putin's War in Ukraine, Russia Campaign or for Global Counter-Revolution. So these are 2 wonderful keynote speakers, and I invite Silvia for the first. Thank you.
Great emotion and also flattering introduction, so thank you, Piternella. I have a loud Italian voice, if I might hear. Okay, perfect. So I'll try not to, in the interest of the online, I'll try not to dance around too much, but it's a great emotion to be here this morning. And to begin with, I want to thank Piternella, PJ, and all organizers for making this amazing forum possible. As Piternella mentioned, I'm Silvia from the University of Oslo. I think I was just discussing over the reception with some of you last night that these regional events really constitute the lifeblood of our research community. I was I remember walking back to the hotel yesterday and thinking, if we had a DSAI in Norway, it would be just splendid. So I might tap into your into actually how this network was built. We have a lot to learn. It is my pleasure to give this opening address this morning, and it's I think when I had the privilege to receive Piternella and PJ's invite to join you this morning, we were like, okay, what can be a topic that can open up our conversation on such an important theme as territories of technologies, innovation, and development. And I am myself, again, I met some of you yesterday in the opening panel. I'm myself a researcher of this contended field called ICT for development. I think one of the opening reflections yesterday was we started by being an object, a research object in a broader field, I would say across information systems, development, geography. And we really became a field of research, very much inspiring the discussions that, as Piternella said, we'll have today. My topic, the core guiding thread of my research, sometimes it is difficult to summarize 14 years of work in a guiding topic. I think I can say I work on digital identity, which I'm going to soon define as the conversion of individualities into data. And I wanted to tell you this morning a story of injustice. I think this is my revealing moment in which I say that Unfair ID is actually the title of my forthcoming book, forthcoming with stage in 2024. So first book, lot of emotion, lot of sleepless nights. I thought it was like writing a longer paper, and it wasn't so, as I learned on my skin. But it's a story of injustice. So the argument I'm going to bring to you this morning very much links to what was just said. So a lot of narratives of ICT for development are narratives of injustice, narratives of harm perpetrated through digital technologies, which I'm going to unpack with my research primarily on the use of identity, of digital identification in a food security program in southern India. But it's also a story of resistance I want to tell you this morning, because I think the whole argument with which I want to begin our conversation is that only by understanding unfairness in digital identity in global development program can we build fairness. So can we understand how injustice is built and then develop forms of resistance to such issues. I'm gonna keep this to a half hour, not a half hour Italian time, a half hour, because I'm very interested in the discussion after this and continuing that into the coffee break. I think the most difficult question I'm gonna try to answer this morning is what is digital identity? Because if we think about it, all of us can have very different definitions of this key term. So in my work, I conceive digital identity very much as the outcome of a process of conversion of human identities into digital data. I don't know how that works in Ireland. For instance, in Norway, we have well, let's call it a social security number, also associated to our biometrics that enables our access to many services. As I will argue this morning, an enabling technology can sadly very easily become a disabling technology when something in that process of identification and authentication doesn't work as planned. I think the spark of my research, and I'm soon gonna get into the 3 building blocks. I won't bombard you with the theory at 10 a.m., but we have 3 building blocks that we need for our discussion today. And that's this idea of identification. So the moment in which a person registers their credentials with a central identification body, maybe through reader documents, through a proof of address, but an identification process, an authentication process that happens when the person is recognized through their demographic or biometric credentials. So for example, when I use my when I came in here, I didn't have biometric face scanning, which became the norm when entering the UK. So it was interesting to enter the country without biometric face scanning, but that's an authentication case. So the person is recognized through a certain technology. And then crucial is authorization. Based on that authentication or not, I can or cannot avail, for instance, a service. Or very bluntly, I can or cannot pass a border control, a border management. So we need all these 3 building blocks. But I think the real spark of my digital ID research is this, the fact that digital identity systems are really proliferating in, and I say this with my heart as a development studies researcher. My journey, I work in an information systems department now, but my journey started with a development studies study course, which led me to fall in love with ICT for development. And then to be a bit let down by the systematic injustice found in that field. But that after all inspired this work. So, digital identity, to begin with. Yeah, well, this is what I just mentioned. These are 3 building blocks that we are going to need this morning. And again, I think the reason I tend to dissect these 3 building blocks a bit is that we sometimes tend to conflate them, isn't it? For example, we say I identify myself to obtain a certain service. That's actually an authentication moment. And what I'm going to argue is that the nexus between these last 2, so the subordination of authorization, so accessing, for example, food commodities. I work on a food security program in southern India. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it soon. But in that program, the access to these very subsidized rights with sugar, even non-food items like kerosene, is subordinated to authentication. So only the moment the person is recognized as being who they are and below the poverty line can they actually access commodities. Now, why is this so important? Let me give you actually an example from the research I do. I study, I think it's very hard to put a date on my research, but I started in the early 2010s studying a program called the Public Distribution System. That's an Indian food security scheme. Anyone familiar with this scheme? Some of you are. Fantastic. It's a scheme that essentially delivers again, food, primarily food, but also some non-food essentials like kerosene and basic need goods to below poverty line households. That's an all India program. I work in the south, I work in 2 states called Kerala and Karnataka. So what is happening to this program, I must say, with the development studies hat, this is one of the most beautiful development programs I've seen. It's designed to redistribute commodities within the country. India produces roughly 3 times the food grains it consumes, but it's a matter of redistributing across states. Some states, for example, in the north, produce more than what they consume. Other states, like Kerala, where I work, Kerala produces roughly 15% of the rice they consume, so there's a lot of redistribution. What happens where I work very much in the moment in which the person encounters the technology. So what I have here in the pictures are these small stalls called ration shops. These are stores where the person can go use now their biometric credentials. Not all ration shops have a fingerprinting device. That's the system of that was taken in southern Bangalore, Karnataka. But in many states, their number is increasing fast. The delivery of rice and of basic commodities became subordinated to biometric identification. One can say for the best of reasons, because well, when we look at large development programs, we look in many cases, and definitely in large food security programs, at limited resources. So one wants to be sure that those households that receive those limited resources are entitled, and crucially that the person is fully connected. So a lot of responsibility is placed on digital identity. Just to add, in a way, problems to problems, we can see, Fernanda mentioned the situation in Western Asia these days, but identity is very much the basis for rights. I think in the digital ID field, we call it the right, the right to a nationality. We really call it the right to have rights, in a way. And Fernanda just mentioned the situation of Palestine. Palestine is a very limited case for identity researchers, because we do have what is called an accountability gap. So there is an absence of a, well, factual national authority. That means that not having a national ID card, and that's the situation for large communities of Palestinian refugees. So we do have an agency, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, that in a way steps in for the states, provides schooling, provides clinics, but does not provide the right to a nationality. So the right to a nationality that is substantiated in an ID card. Essentially, they're missing what? The basis of the formation of rights. Now, why is this so important for development? Very briefly, but in a way as a thought provocation I wanted to share with you, and actually say that digital identity is in many ways, again, development studies had a great thing, at least on paper. And why so? Because by matching individuals with their credentials, well, essentially what I just shown for the Indian case can happen. So we can do 2 important things at the same time. Tackle an inclusion error. So what is an inclusion error? Is the erroneous inclusion of someone that is not entitled to a certain development program. But at the same time, at least on paper, we will see in a minute that the reality can be a bit more blurred. At the same time, we tackle an exclusion error. So essentially, the error that we make when someone who is entitled, is below the poverty line, is entitled to that rice, that wheat, that sugar, is not recognized. So if we do what we said in the beginning, so converting human identities into data, I can actually match that person to that classification, be it below the poverty line, be it there can be overlapping classifications, for example, in terms of family members. So that person who is below the poverty line has a household of 4 people, so they are entitled to this amount of commodities. Great tool, isn't it? I think something that was mentioned yesterday is that digital identity, actually legal identity, sorry, that is in many ways related to the digitalization of identity. Legal identity also has its own development goal target, Sustainable Development Goal target 16.9. So this idea of achieving a legal identity, including birth registration, we can actually debate it, the two are not equal, by 2030. So by giving a legal identity to people, what we just said, the right to have rights is to be fulfilled. Isn't it beautiful? Beautiful, no? There's a little problem. Not so beautiful in practice, and this is my attempt. I tried my best to do justice to the, I must say, burgeoning amount of research that is emerging across fields on what in this talk I call the injustice of digital ID. Essentially, empirical studies of digital identity offer many, perhaps too many for a single slide, problematization of what we just said. So we start with the discourse. I think a large part of the discourse on digital ID injustice is on exclusions. So what I just mentioned, the person that, for example, out of lack of readability of their body, we might have heard this story many times, it features in my findings. So the person whose fingerprint might not be correctly read by that machine, and then what happens? Is that person going to be supplied rice with? Not necessarily. What I argue in my work is that the exclusions are an important, but not the only, and perhaps not even the deepest issue of digital ID. It's those of you familiar with a surveillance studies literature might be familiar with this idea of compassionate repression, to cite my colleague Gianluca Iazzolino from the University of Manchester. So technologies, and we spoke about them in the panel last night, technologies that pertain to border management, for instance, pertain to the profiling of people, and can actually result in violence on the people they profile. We put forward yesterday the idea of adverse digital incorporation from the work of colleague Richard Hicks. So being incorporated in systems that actually produce adverse consequences on us. In the field of digital identity, we must say, and that's what I'm gonna try to make sense of in the next 10 minutes, there is very much a discourse on ID as a route to a systemic violation of human rights. And for those of you interested in this topic, there was a landmark report last year by the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at New York University. It's called Paving a Digital Road to Hell, and it has a longer subtitle. And it's a report that looks at human rights harm perpetrated through digital identity systems, and actually to a very specific type of digital identity systems, which are centralized at the state level, which are data heavy, and control access points to many essential services. So what do I try to do in my research? Essentially try to make sense of this existential conundrum of a very strong development of orthodoxy, again, this idea of combating inclusion and exclusion errors at the same time, and a burgeoning literature talking about what actually goes wrong, about how harmful outcomes, just to cite again the New York University report, are produced. So what I'd like to do, and what I want to propose you this morning is one, and I would like to underline one possible interpretation of how to taxonomize injustice, how to make sense of injustice in digital identity. I do draw on the work that I published with colleague Sean Modas from Emilion University in 2019. It is a work that I'm currently expanding in my forthcoming book, Unfair ID, but that proposes a taxonomy of 3 main ways in which ID-induced injustice comes up. the argument I make in the book is actually that we do need a digital identity system defined again as a system where identities are converted into data. So we do need a digital identity system to produce these forms of injustice across development schemes. Very briefly, I'll make an overview of the three of them. We call them a legal, an informational, and a design-related injustice. And a little spoiler of the end of this talk is that actually the design-related injustice might be the most entrenched in the way the technology is built. By a legal injustice, we mean very much the subordination of essential right to two things: correct identification of the person, as we defined it before, so through their data in a certain database, and through correct authentication of the person whose fingerprint is misread at the ration shop or at the access point of a service will fall in this category. We call it a legal injustice because rights as fundamental as the right to food, and hardly think of a more fundamental right, the right to shelter, the right to life, becomes subordinate to this form of technology. There are two more injustices a bit more hidden, and that's why I argue that exclusions are an important problem of digital ID, but perhaps not the deepest. We found an informational injustice that I'm going to soon define as an injustice induced at the level of data management. So what do people know of what happens, not so much to their data. I read privacy research, but I don't do privacy research. So it's not a matter of what the state does with my data, but how the systems with which, for example, food security system with which rights are governed change on digital ID. So lack of information on that really results in informational injustice. And we will see also a design-related injustice, which, like I said, is in a way perpetrated through the very way a system, a digital ID system, is designed. So it's not anymore, some of you might be familiar with this idea of a dark side. No? Did we hear this expression, the dark side of technology? But it's not a side, so it's not a peripheral, because by side I understand a very incidental, a very peripheral problem. What we look at here is very much a form of harm designed in the way a certain technology is. So a very brief overview of the three of our taxonomy. Oh yeah, I think MD there is for Masiero, and that's 2019. So like I said, legal injustice is perhaps the most researched form of injustice in digital ID research. So this idea of subordinating the right to food, the right to shelter, to the fact that I turn up at the access point, the machine recognizes me, so two things, recognizes me as who I claim to be, and in virtue of that, recognizes me as entitled to access that rice, that wheat, etc. What we found in our, and this is mainly for my 12 years work on the public distribution system in India, is that we mentioned, and you might indeed be familiar with stories of users who are maybe not recognized with their fingerprint and then are not supplied their commodities. What we really found is that users for which the system used to work before, so my PhD was actually on the same version of this program, but before biometric identification was introduced. And one outcome we found often is, for example, having entire families, like families of 4 or 5 more members, queuing together to the shop in order to make sure that at least one person will be recognized with their fingerprint, and the ratio will come. So that of exclusions then, what I think is striking here, that affects people that before digitization could access the same system without too many problems. And then essentially introduces, that's why I say it introduces a layer of injustice that requires a digital architecture to play out. Some of the most extreme outcomes of this exclusion relate to Adhar. It is actually the database, the biometric database of India, connected to the public distribution system, largest biometric database in the world, very sadly found to be associated to hunger deaths in a state called Jharkhand, where systematically households were disconnected from the food security system once biometrics were introduced. One cannot talk about deaths caused by the introduction of biometrics, but temporarily associated to that, temporarily associated to the disconnection of this person's ration card from authentication. So that's one family of injustices. And again, I introduce you to this second and less, when I say less visible form of injustice, so this informational injustice, I very much mean this idea of how information from biometric, from demographic recognition is really used to transform the anti-poverty architectures we look at. In our research on, again, on the use of Aadhaar or biometrics in India's public distribution system, we did find, and it wasn't so hidden now that I think about it, it was a very publicized development policy. It was found that the whole idea launched in India's economic survey in 2015 was to transform a system of ration collection, a system of ration delivery into a cash transfer system. So not anymore accepting rice in the shop, but accepting cash from a banking correspondent. It was a policy that when discussed with, well, my work is mainly qualitative, case-based, when discussing with people in the shops, so presenting them with a scenario, what if you were to get cash instead of getting rations, was encountered with a lot of fear for many reasons. The first one being this idea of this idea of having to leave something perceived as very secure, which was the materiality of rice, of wheat, of commodities on people's tables. So this idea, I had many people saying, well, yeah, perhaps the guy, the ration dealer, perhaps doesn't really give me the correct change. Sometimes the rations magically disappear, but at least there is a materiality of something on the table every month. Something that is not perceived to be there with a cash transfer program. What I want to say is, I cite here the research of colleagues Juan Lopez and Diego Serna Aragon, featured in the book COVID-19 from the Margins 2021, is that when we look at subsidy programs, for example, the pandemic-related subsidy programs that have emerged in many countries, informational injustice sadly offers many examples of itself in this idea of algorithmic assignation of subsidies. If it's actually an open access volume called COVID-19 from the Margins, and both Serna Aragon and Lopez speak about how in Latin America these subsidy assignation programs were built, but households really didn't know on what basis they would or would not receive a certain subsidy. So very much this idea of what is opaque is the information on what happens to the law based on biometrics. I use my next 3 minutes to tell you one bad news and one good news. The sad news is that actually there is a third form of injustice that I already touched upon, and we call design-related injustice. So this idea of, and I want to say, the reason I say this is a sad note, is that what we found in our study published in 2019, is that this idea of, recognizing all those entitled and only those entitled really didn't result in combating both inclusion and exclusion. It actually really resulted in combating inclusion. So if I'm not entitled to the system, there's no way I'm going to get my ration. But if I am the widow, the farmer, the person systematically excluded, that cannot authenticate, that the person that perhaps is in a village where that's another reason for exclusions, where the ration dealer, the man in the shop, has maybe not paid the monthly bill, so the machine is not working today. So that systematic exclusion is not incidental, it's not aside, it is in the system. So the system is designed in order to prioritize one type of error to the other. And that doesn't really do justice to all those that remain systematically out. But I want to finish, I think I have a couple more Italian minutes, to finish here and say, yeah, I think this is, again, and I also want to highlight, on top of these different forms of injustice, the fact that open letters are, there is this one signed by Access Now and other organizations to the World Bank, but they're really proliferating in a way, addressing the big funders. Yesterday we spoke about vendors, but it's also a matter of who funds these digital ID programs. For instance, the ID for Development initiative of the World Bank. But the positive note with which I finish is that I think the real reason for studying this systematic unfairness is the possibility to build fair identity programs. I just have a super quick couple of notes on this, and I really want our discussion to be also on this, to be on building fairness rather than just unfairness. I think 10 plus years in this field taught me that fair ID is actually possible. It is possible, I think, if we take stock of the systemic unfairness field in digital technologies. It is, I think, oh yeah, one initiative that some people might have heard of in this development field. I don't know if you heard of this system called MOSIP. Some of you have. MOSIP is an open source system to build digital identity, very much built on the outline of Aadhaar, which is again India's biometric database. So initiatives like MOSIP try to bring digital identity in the open source space. One good news, one bad news. The good news is, yes, open source solves one problem, which is vendor lock-in, so being locked with a certain vendor, that is, we said yesterday, really gives control to certain particular profit-led powers. My view is that sadly, open source alone doesn't build fair ID, because with open source, without addressing legal, informational, design and justice program, the real risk is to replicate the same issues in an open source way. Is this even worse? This we could say. But I finish here. I want to finish with, again, with the note that but at least my view, again, and I want to underline the subjectivity of this view, is that learning from grassroots efforts of digital ID and doing the research for my book, I met many grassroots localized examples of construction of fair forms of ID, really involving, for example, the human rights impact assessments. The communities affected really can do a lot. I think I wanted to finish with a happy story, and I want to describe the work of Kenyan organization Haki na Sheria. That's some of you might be familiar with them. It's an organization working with advocacy of people systematically denied a national ID card in the Kenyan context. And one of the things, I was interviewing some of the activists of Haki na Sheria for my book, is that really there is a systematic advocacy working with the people who are affected by denial of an ID, but also bringing ID registration to the people. So when I had my last interview with Haki na Sheria, what was in progress was the construction of mobile registration spots. So spots that went county by county, especially in counties where it is hard there to get an ID for a number of reasons related, for example, to being very close to borders, Somalia with Ethiopia. So bring ID registration to people, while at the same time advocating for their rights in a way that the digital ID programs are really designed with an impact, with a human rights impact assessment in mind. So is local advocacy the solution? I think is one solution in my research. it is the most powerful at the level of building ID with the people. I think, yeah, that's what I meant when I said that I feel like this starts from user engagement. So this is really what I wanted to finish this morning. Big thanks, and I look forward to discussing with you.
Trying to figure out who was going to do the Q&A. Thank you very much for this wonderful and slightly depressing, but happily ending on that happy note. We have about 10 minutes, 15 minutes to see how far we want to eat into our coffee break, and we don't have a roving mic, unfortunately. It's quite a small space, so I'm welcoming questions just by being a little bit loud, please.
Thanks so much for leading the interesting presentation. My name is Silvia Masiero, and I'm a lecturer in development practice at Trinity College. And I really enjoyed your presentation this morning, but I'd like to kind of challenge a little bit, maybe the confusion around even the possibility of fair ID. So if you think about it, you started your conversation today talking about the right to have rights, right? So if you think about the original coining of that sentence, of that line and that sentiment, we're looking at Hannah Arendt on refugees, right? And so in that context, when Hannah Arendt wrote that line, her intention was to highlight the fact that when you tie rights to identity in any way, when that identity is stripped or removed by the state, as it was at the time for the Jewish population living right across Europe, then your right to have rights dissolves, right? So that idea of tying identity and rights is really problematic, and I think you point to that when you talk about legal injustice. But I suppose if thinking now about the work of Giorgio Agamben, for example, right, when Agamben was looking at the theory of sovereignty, again it's around how states then control rights, and when states control rights in that way, when rights and entitlements are owned by states, that's where you have the possibility of inclusive exclusion, essentially, which I think is where you're very much working with those concepts. So if we think about the digital part of this, like the digital allocation of an identity, and I may be using the term allocation incorrectly, but that is essentially a mechanism, right? It's just a more efficient mechanism that facilitates greater control and greater domination by the state, right? Or by the entity that owns that identity, be it a corporation or whatever. So my question to you is it ever possible to have fair ID as we define it if the allocation, the foundation or the grounding of rights on identity in the first instance is so problematic because of the reality that identity can be stripped, removed, ignored, denied?
I think it's the heart of the problem. So big thanks for bringing it up. I think two very quick thoughts on this. In further grounding what you're saying, I think one thing I didn't mention today is that India's PDS, actually the public distribution system, had a big expansion, a little bit not an untying from identity, but essentially an expansion of access to more across categories of entitlement in 2013, and development economists back then sort of predicted, okay, this is not going to work because how to serve so many more commodities, so many more communities with the same amount of commodities. It did work out exactly because identity was, in a way, not delinked from a below poverty line status, but the entitlements associated to below poverty line were expanded. So in a way, that's a sort of broadening the rights associated to ID. Whether a fair ID is per se possible, I think when it comes to development management, in a way, ID has become a constitutive element of development programs. So in a way, we are sort of induced to think of ID as a basis of development programs. Whether it is theoretically possible, it's in principle really problematic. I think in the space of development, we need to think ID as a base of programs, as a base of essential delivery, service delivery programs. But whether it is possible on a more abstract level is a good discussion, and I'm not even sure I have a positive answer. So.
And Simi?
So thanks for that, Sylvia. I really enjoyed that talk, and it made me think quite a bit of some conversations. This is really more of a comment or a conversational point rather than a question as such, maybe. Sorry, everybody feels depressed when they hear that.
Oh, I like it.
We've had some conversations with the thematic group of the Human Development Association on the topic of human security. And this point that you made about people who had previously felt that they had a secure access becoming insecure is part of this conversation on how does, should this theme of human security respond to a number of different global challenges, including the challenge of digitalization and digital identification. So it just, we've been talking a lot about what is freedom from fear and what is freedom from want. And going back to this development of freedom idea, which helps us understand that poor people are very vulnerable to having that sense of security eroded. And it seems to be the case that fear of losing something that you have outstrips the opposite, the happiness at gaining something that you haven't had up to now. So the weighting that fear of loss is very great. And it's something that we've been talking a lot about. And how can we think about this in this envelope of human security? And I know that there's been some quite high-level documents, UNDP and a special report on human security last year, and then it became the UNDP's human development theme, one of the themes for the FFC. And I think that also the Secretary General is very interested in this particular topic. So it's just something to link the work on unfair ID and this very useful example you have of this of the public distribution system. This is a well-known example which involves a great number of people and to connect this. So let's be connected and talk more about this, because certainly there's a community of people interested in this question of what does it mean for development when people who need something lose something that really matters.
You can reply, yeah, briefly.
Yes, it's as always very thought-provoking. Thank you, Suming. Just wanted to quickly mention another thing I didn't mention this morning, and that's one in relation to what you said. One of the key findings of the report by the New York University from 2022 is that there is a systemic discrepancy between evidence of harm in centralized digital ID programs and evidence of benefits. So when we think, okay, people that don't have what they used to have, what evidence do we have of benefits of ID schemes? And I recently interviewed the lead author of that report, Kathleen Cioffi. I think I had a very direct question on benefits. And that's also where they are working at New York University. So far, evidence of benefits of centralized digital ID schemes remain scant. So in terms of what do people have now that they didn't have before, yeah, it's very much this discrepancy between evidence of harm and of benefits, and we need to bring it up as we talk about this.
Yeah, it was just really wonderful to think about harm and benefit, because it seemed that the conversation on security and insecurity went towards the data privacy piece. And it was about securing data against breaches of privacy, rather than securing people against things that they really felt insecure about. So that's where the human security argument has tried to bridge that divergence or that detour.
Oh, geez, we have 3 questions here. I have to be quick because we do have, sorry, I'll start at the back of the room and then I'll work to the front. So there's somebody there, yeah, you with the, yeah, you with the class.
I'm sure the costs are citizens and the market development practice have today. And that's what you know what you just said now in terms of efficiency. We know that from what we are doing presentation, this system does with autonomy, aggregates injustice in how things are distributed. But is it able, through this new biometric system, which I assume was motivated by efficiency incentives, being more efficient in distributing goods in terms of various economics, calculate transfer, and then shifting that from using into distribute goods? Is it actually more efficient? Is biometric system actually enabling the government to deliver an unjust system to more people? Or even if it's anecdotal experience, have you seen that? There's not complete goals, by the way.
We go very quickly, yes. Maybe we'll get one or two questions and then we say, so Eamon and then Tony.
Yeah, I suppose my question was around, have you seen much use of it for deliberate exclusion rather than what seemed to be here accidental or coincidental exclusions or design exclusions? But what about deliberate exclusions? And is that sometimes linked to the fact that it's state linked and kind of citizen linked rather than human person linked? So then if somebody is stateless, or if somebody has an identity contested by the state, is it just a way of further excluding them and ghettoizing?
That was great, and I'm not sure this is going to make sense because you've spurred me on to think about a lot of things. But in your interesting bit about the right to food, in the overall discussion around this whole area, the distinction between having a human right just because you're human and having a right because you've got a digital identity seems to me to be enormous. And if I were communicating with a politician about the issue, I would be emphasizing that the digital ID is key to the question of against whom a right is exercisable, rather than about whether the right exists at all, which it obviously does. So I'm not sure whether that makes sense, but if it does, then I'd be interested in your thoughts.
No, it does. It's like, thanks very much. I think all three questions and more questions over coffee.
Yeah,
So, thanks for your question about the efficiency and of, I think there are two main sources of data. I speak about public distribution system here, but at large when it comes to anti-poverty programs. And I can speak for like qualitative ethnographic data, but there is plenty of econometric work. I think I'm very happy to share these slides with bibliography also. The work cited here by Riti Kahera, by Kartik Murali Moran, they're all economists that work on PDS. I think speaking for a qualitative perspective, which is what I do, I actually met but several people really happy with their new biometrics here because the system does recognize them and essentially nothing changed from before. I think my work tends to look more at what I'm citing the I think it's the economic survey of 2015, the government of India says an incidental problem. Yeah, an incidental problem that Riti Kahera estimated that it was over 4% for only one state, Jharkhand. 4% of a population of thousands of families is a substantial number. So I tend to look, citing again the New York University report, at the marginalized environment. So, but yes, there are, I can speak about efficiency gains, but there are stories of people who are, no problem, nothing happens. So there is absolutely that component. My research doesn't deny it, absolutely. Deliberate exclusions. I didn't find evidence of this in the PDS. It's so, for example, we hear about, and this is beyond my research, but for example, the design in technology of features that deliberately exclude some people. The book of Design Justice by Sasha Costanza Schock, for instance, speaks about systematic exclusion of non-binary identifying people, so people whose body doesn't perhaps conform to the canons of a male or a female body. And there's a very good discussion of, for instance, airport scanners in that book. That's the opening discussion. So deliberate exclusion is a massive element in digital ID, not something I found in the PDS. In a way, I think I can say thankfully, but definitely something I find. And the broader, we finish with the broader question of rights. And I think this relates to the first question that was asked about the possibility of a fair idea. I think as an information systems researcher, that technology, in a way, technology alone does very little. It is, to cite Langdon Winner here, the politics that technology carries. So I really think, and that's why I mentioned this expansion of food rights in the food security system in the PBS, because really making the system closer to a universal system really did a lot. And the technology didn't change. The technology really only enacted the fact that more people have a right to the same system. So the technology alone, and this I don't think is a massive finding, doesn't do much, but this also means that if we think fairer policies and inscribe them into our technology, there's really a lot of it. And on this happy note, coffee.